So I'd like to introduce the panelists, and I'll just do them all at once here first, and I'll try to go in order, but I don't have my notes in order. Nick Jevock spent 11 years working as a newspaper reporter in Bozeman and Butte before joining the Montana Wildlife Federation as conservation director. He worked for MWF on key wildlife, habitat, and public access issues, and is an avid sportsman who hunts and fishes throughout the state, along with his English setters Sapphire and Willow. Okay. Amy Seaman works for Montana Audubon in Helena, and she is the Director of Policy and Science with a background in biology and ecology. Ann Miller is the Director of the Pork Producers Council, has been for 15 years, and she'll talk a little bit about her role with the pork producers. Dr. Anna Forseth is the Program Veterinarian with Department of Livestock in Helena. She attended Montana State University and earned her DVM from Colorado State. Will be completing a master's in veterinary preventive medicine from Iowa State this coming spring. She also worked in Iowa, where she worked on swine research. Anna oversees preparedness efforts, among other things. Who's next? Rick. Rick Northrup serves as the Wildlife Habitat Bureau Chief for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, has worked for the department for 29 years, primarily on habitat issues. He earned an MS in Fish and Wildlife Management from Montana State University and a BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Science and Environmental Management. Dr. Jennifer Ramsey is our state veterinarian for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She has degrees from Ohio State University and UC Davis. And Darby, last but not least, but I maybe lost your paper here, Darby.
I'm just Darby.
No. There we go. Darby Warner has worked for Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation since 1987. He worked his way through the ranks from an entry-level position as an adjuster to his current position as Executive Director of Insurance. Darby has been professionally and personally involved in agriculture industry for most of his life. He and his wife Cindy own and operate a grain farm at Melfort, Saskatchewan. We've heard about Melfort already today. Yeah, good. Okay, with that, Nick, if you want to come up. It's 5 minutes each, you guys. I know it's hard.
Not when you deal with the state legislature.
There you go.
Make your point and sit down. Well, thanks everybody for having me again. I'm Nick Jevock. I'm the Conservation Director for the Montana Wildlife Federation, and I appreciate the sense of humor this morning that sort of permeated when we got this bill passed back in 2015 at several of the hearings. But we are the state's oldest wildlife conservation organization. We've been around for 83 years. We're out there for wildlife, for habitat, and for public opportunities to enjoy those tremendous resources. And I really have to say the Department of Livestock did an excellent job when Montana's bill was written. They saw the seriousness of this issue. It's a very strong bill, and it was incredibly well written, and because it creates such a strong disincentive for people to transport these. You know, I am absolutely confounded that we live in a state with 11 native big game species, and you hear hunters say we need those here. Because our response is no, we don't. You know, they're obviously horrible. They do an estimated $2 billion, feral swine do, in property and crop damage throughout the nation. They eat deer fawns, they eat songbirds. I think Amy will address some of that. And so the way that bill was written, in fact, a hunter, if you see feral swine, you cannot shoot them. And again, as Marty has brought up before, some of their biggest spread in the United States is at 80 miles an hour on the back of a pickup, because we've heard actually cases of people planting feral swine on a property, unbeknownst to a landowner, coming back in a year and saying, I see you have a feral swine problem. I can help you with that. And you can't. I mean, I learned a ton this morning already from this presentation. I mean, the issues I work on, we look at our native elk, and if you have a recruitment rate of 30 calves per 100 cows in a year, that's a strong reproduction more than sufficient to replace what hunters take. And these things just, you know, we say breed like rabbits, but I think anymore I'm going to say, geez, they breed like feral swine. So, you know, two litters a year. So, we've seen other cases. You know, we're part of the National Wildlife Federation. Some of our sister, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, I get their newsletter, and there is something about feral swine every month. Just how we deal with this, what we're trying to do. I remember a case a few years ago in North Carolina where it was somebody shot a 550-pound feral pig, and it was hailed as this great trophy event, and photos all over the place. So I think we see, you know, any species that gains a constituency. I mean, we learned there's a petition going around Saskatchewan to save them, and I think they're doing just fine, basically, on what we've seen. So, you know, this is just another example of that long-standing, decades-long partnership between hunters and landowners to do what helps our native wildlife. We all know that landowners provide tremendous habitat for our deer and elk and all kinds of other species, antelope, everything. And, you know, we basically don't want them here, and we know that. So, again, the way Montana's law was written very carefully, a landowner can take them on first occurrence as a way to try to get a handle on them, but people can't. And we know hunters are some of our biggest eyes and ears out there in the field, and they have to be reported. So it's pretty simple. I'm open to questions, and I appreciate everybody's interest in this, because I think this is an example, just like in 2000 when we banned game farms in Montana, and MWF led the way on that, of where Montana's always been a leader in being proactive in natural resource issues, and we're very lucky we don't have them here yet, and we want to keep it that way. So I think with a lot of the people in this room working together, hopefully we can do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Amy?
Awesome, thank you. I'll probably echo a few of the comments that Nick Jivak made. So again, Amy Seaman with Montana Audubon, the Director of Policy and Science there. And we were similarly present during the passage of this first piece of legislation, and at that point was the first time that I had spent any time really looking into the potential impacts or some of the range shifts that we'd seen. And at that point I can remember testifying that they were already in over 40 states in some fashion or another. And one of the questions I had this morning as well, and is a major concern for our organization, so we really focus on habitat at a large scale that I think is really similar to a lot of the issues we have, because we are talking about large landscapes that we look at quite often. From that, so just that habitat perspective of how damaging they can be. And my big question, and I think a concern our organization has, is how do you monitor, and what are some of those most effective ways to at least know that we're catching them visually when they are getting here. So I think that's one thing just to bring. And one of the pieces that we may have more of a focus on than some other organizations is really their effects in riparian habitat. And that's something Montana Audubon, we're in almost every seat and table that we're at, we're talking about riparian areas, because in Montana it's less than 4% of our landscape. And so really just a small area in a state that's 94 million acres. And our breeding birds, so we have 245-ish species of breeding birds, and over half really rely on riparian areas for breeding. And so what we hear about their behavior with wallowing, eating just about anything that has carbon, I think that's what I've read, anything with caloric value basically will go down their throats. And so a lot of that happens to be in riparian areas, where a lot of our threatened, not only birds and other wildlife species, mussels and invertebrates, they're sort of eat everything, but also threatened plant species that end up being primarily in those riparian habitats. So I know moving forward, that's one of our major concerns, and just issues that we want to raise and make sure people have on their radar. And so one little thing I noticed as well, jumping from riparian, is one of the few things that may not be present, but I think we'll hear a lot from veterinarians and the scientists in the room, is thinking about the disease potential that these animals have in our environment. And one of the stories that really stuck out to me was that a salmonella outbreak in California was actually connected to feral swine being on these sort of spinach fields and having disease outbreak that way, and actually having people be killed from it. You know, so I think there is even the public health issue that I think is even one step further removed, but the only thing that I've noticed so far that made me not present in the room at the moment. And then so just to jump back a little bit to the habitat piece, as Nick mentioned, you know, it is interesting to think of them as a potentially other large game species, but we are always in the room talking about non-game species. We have 746 in Montana. Many of those are threatened. 63 bird species are species of concern. And swine have particular impacts to ground nesting birds, again, just because of the rooting, the wallowing, and that type of behavior. And so in some other states, especially on the East Coast, bobwhite quail have had a really major issue recovering a population that's already pretty threatened, but they're ground nesters, so they have a lot of impacts from swine. And as well, moving a little bit farther west into the Midwest, the lesser prairie chicken, birds like that, ground nesters that are really heavily impacted, which of course brings up sage grouse and our efforts as well to not only keep sage grouse on the landscape, but in some places restore sharp-tailed grouse and other birds like that that we're actively trying to restore, which also sort of begs those questions for other wildlife managers is what species are we trying to restore that may then be negatively impacted if swine sort of arrive on the tail of that. And that's sort of the more unknown piece of it in some of our concerns is that there are a lot of unknowns with how general dynamics between populations may change. And as another small example from California, they pointed out that the channel fox there, the Channel Island fox, was almost completely eradicated because of feral swine, but it was actually an interaction between feral swine, golden eagles, and bald eagles that eventually caused the collapse of this fox population. So I think that's just where we're in that unknown realm of what does happen dynamically on the landscape. And so I won't talk too much more about that. Ryan really touched on the one, I think, important fact when we think about Montana. We have fantastic habitat, and that means the pigs can do really, really well. And again, just getting back to this riparian area, I was so surprised they're not too disturbed by cold temperatures, but what swine actually don't tolerate is really hot temperatures. So as it gets warmer, just during a season, you know, they seek out those riparian areas as refuges. And the heat stress is actually something that's kind of unique, but we'll move them around our landscape quite a bit. But we do have great habitat here, so obviously it's at risk. And thank you for your time, and I appreciate being invited and also happy to answer questions.
So I am Ann Miller. I'm director of the Montana Pork Producers Council. A little of my background, I undid about 100 years of family migration from Montana and moved back to Montana. My degree is in ag economics from University of Idaho. And afterwards, I convinced my parents to tear a little more of their hair out and left for Montana. I was originally brought here to the state as a trail crew leader for Montana Conservation Corps. So, you know, their daughter got her college degree and then lived in a tent in the woods for a year. I'm sure that it was a little different than a lot of my classmates chose to do. Our organization is actually two arms. So we're the producer association in the state. We represent producers that range in size from youth, young people selling their animals in fairs across the state each year. This last year we had 1,995 students submit their fair hogs for evaluation in a program we call the Symbol of Excellence. It's a partnership with Montana State University. We also work with Montana's Hutterite colonies, whom produce 98% of the pork in the state. Gross value of product in 2018, we were looking at just shy of $53 million in gross market receipts. And those are for the hogs sold both by youth as well as your producers that are using both indoor and outdoor systems. My goal today here would be to learn from our partners in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Dr. Forsyth and the Department of Livestock and I have a lot of overlap as far as concerns with animal disease. So I will yield that part of time to her to cover it. We also have great concerns about damage to crops and habitat. So all of our producers typically have acreage, and so even if their hogs are in an enclosed environment, it's still going to be affecting, as Amy said, the riparian areas. It'll be affecting their crops. We do feed a lot of barley in this state to the pork industry, and so looking at even impacting the domestic food chain with disturbance to crops like barley is a concern as well. And then last of all, and certainly not least, would be just family safety, as far as if you have a population in our state that does a lot of hunting. I know our prior speaker had talked about, you know, the hogs arriving at gunshots. That is something that would be of concern with a lot of properties allowing hunting as far as impacts on the human end of things as well. Our association is also comprised of two arms. So we have the pork checkoff side, that is a mandatory payment made that farmers put into one large pot to promote, educate, and conduct research. So pork checkoff has presented a lot of the science behind feral swine in other states such as Michigan. And then we also completely separately funded have a legislative arm that is funded through voluntary donations by producers. Today, I'm most looking forward to hearing ideas and opportunities for collaboration similar to Sask Pork, and I look forward to your questions.
Good morning. I was asked to speak specifically to the disease component of feral swine, and my focus will be on the potential impacts on the commercial swine or domestic swine population, as well as some other livestock species. Feral swine can certainly have an impact on our wildlife population, but I will defer to Dr. Ramsey to cover some of those details. Do you mind if I... So there are any disease that I discuss today or this in the next couple of minutes can be a concern for our domestic swine producers. And then there are a kind of a second list of diseases that we are also concerned about when we think about other livestock species such as cattle, sheep, or goats. And so just a few that might trigger some familiarity for many of you in this room. Would be brucellosis, leptospirosis are gastrointestinal diseases such as E. coli, salmonella, pseudorabies. Those would be big diseases of concern potentially for species outside of commercial swine or domestic swine populations. Then, there are certainly a lot of domestic diseases that many producers deal with, such as PRRS or porcine epidemic diarrhea, circovirus. Those can all be kind of circulated within a feral swine population, and if given the opportunity, can pass into a domestic population or commercial population. In addition to some of these diseases that I've mentioned, all of which can be found in the feral swine population within the United States, that's not to say that those are all documented as being present in the Canadian feral swine population. But there are other diseases of major concern that we would consider to be foreign animal diseases, such as African swine fever, which has been in the news quite a bit as of late, foot and mouth disease. Those would be two big ones that feral swine are susceptible to and can certainly pass into our wildlife population, as well as cattle and other small ruminants. And so from a regulatory perspective with the Department of Livestock, many of these diseases are reportable in the state of Montana. So, that will allow us to try to have a little bit better hand on the management if it is something that's introduced. I I've chosen not to go into a lot of detail on these diseases this morning. We could talk all day, but given our 4 to 5 minute time limit, I'm happy to take any specific questions about any specific diseases when we're all finished up here.
Good morning, Rick Northrup with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I oversee the Wildlife Habitat Bureau out of Helena. So, kind of interesting topic here today, and certainly a new topic on my radar. But after Ryan's presentation this morning, it's clear that this is not something that's going to go away. In fact, it's going to be a bigger deal all the time. So, of course, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is responsible for the conservation of all wildlife species, and we have a history with focus on game species. My particular position is to think about that in terms of wildlife habitat, and I kind of think about this in terms of sort of broad categories of impact, and both Amy and Nick have spoken to some of these, but certainly there are physical impacts. You saw the images of what's taken place in Saskatchewan with all the various ground disturbing activities, and I think of what does that translate into? Well, in addition to the direct impacts of swine impacting these native plant communities, no doubt these are going to open up areas for invasive species like you name the list of noxious weeds that will follow that kind of activity. So clearly there are direct and indirect impacts on these habitats. They appear to be drawn to wet areas, as Amy points out as well. And in addition to the direct impacts of riparian areas and wetlands, I'm certain that there are probably fish species of concern that would also be impacted with changes in stream channels and what have you with that kind of activity. And then the direct impacts of water quality, which affects everything from the water we drink, the water that fish swim in and reproduce in, etc. We've got predation issues, obviously, if it fits in their mouth and it has carbon and calories. Enough said there, so skip over that one. And then I think there's just this function of competition. With these being omnivores, we heard the comparison with bears. Frankly, I think there's something to be said where there's a lot of niche overlap with species of concern here. That will have a competitive impact if these critters get a hold in Montana, and so I think that's there's not a silver lining here from my perspective. This is entirely something that we need to get on in a big way, and so I would sum up from a habitat standpoint. I think of the species that we manage in Montana. They're all part of an ecosystem with the interrelatedness of how organisms interact and survive and are benefited by other organisms. And swine would be a classic example of disrupting all various aspects of that in ways that I think I can list some ideas, but I think we'll probably, when reality hits, if it does, which I hope it doesn't, we'll probably learn of all kinds of other impacts that we hadn't really anticipated because of how these ecosystems work. So Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I think since about 1940, has been investing in wildlife habitats, fisheries habitats, parks, both in fee title and in conservation easements, working with landowners to maintain wildlife habitat values. And so we have skin in the game from that standpoint as well. That the public funds that we've invested in to maintain these kinds of habitats is important to the state for our mission, and swine clearly could impact that in a negative way. That productivity. Just as a parting thought, while we're into similes, and I visited with Jeff Mosley on this morning, but as I was going into this, I was reflecting back on just really briefly here on a series of wetlands that we've been doing wetland work on. And when a wetland is really productive, there's clear water, you've got submergent vegetation coming in, emergent vegetation around the outside, and it serves a whole host of benefits, from insects to reproducing birds of various sorts, etc. But you get carp coming into these systems, and they muck out the submergent vegetation, they change the water quality and all that, and you go from a wetland that's probably operating at nearly 100% productivity down to something that's probably something less than 20% productivity. And I think that I was reflecting on that when I was thinking about the impacts of swine coming into the state, and similar types of impacts to other really important habitat features that we have in the state. So I just thought maybe that was a useful metaphor. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions or trying.
Right, so I'm Jennifer Ramsey, and I'm the wildlife veterinarian for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And as I started thinking about today and what kinds of, the question on the agenda was, why do we care? Why are we worried? What concerns us? And I've heard a lot of people already mention a lot of the things that concern me. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and that's probably a good thing, because that means we all have an interest in addressing this potential problem. So, but thinking about, as far as from the wildlife perspective, I definitely have concerns on impacts to wildlife directly, but as a veterinarian, I think Anna and some of you folks would also agree that as a veterinarian, we're trained to think about not just one species or one group of animals. We're really focused on, wildlife, livestock, domestic pets, and human health. So all of those are critical components to the issue. As far as wildlife, folks have already talked about habitat and those direct consequences of competition for resources. That's a very clear potential impact. Indirect competition, predators, and small mammals, reptiles and amphibians, all those kinds of things at risk from the competition aspect. But as a veterinarian, I guess I always kind of circle back to disease. And with pigs, I'm by no means any expert. My exposure to feral pigs was as a student in California at UC Davis and working with California Fish and Game, and being kind of the runner to go deal with problems when people called. But at that point, my sense was overall this is just an overwhelming problem, and we don't know if we'll ever catch up to it. So if we can avoid getting to that point, that would be great. When I think about swine, feral swine, and disease related to wildlife specifically, one of the first things I think about are seeing those photos and this wallowing behavior, their damage and destruction to waterways, their defecating and shedding all kinds of bacteria into those critical waterways where other wildlife are going to be exposed. The other thing that I wonder about there, I think for me a lot of the impacts right now are questionable. I don't really know what's going to happen, but as I learn more about what potential is out there, it's really concerning. Another one that I think about regarding wildlife is in these wallowing sites, is that going to set up really good habitat for mosquitoes and other insect vectors, and then are going to impact our wildlife with things like hemorrhagic disease. And we deal with hemorrhagic disease now, but as our wildlife are faced with other disease issues like chronic wasting disease and things like that, this could be just another layer, another hurdle for us to get them through. Looking at the list of diseases that feral swine can carry, it's a long list. There are big diseases on there that everybody's aware of. Anna mentioned brucellosis, tuberculosis, pseudorabies. There are a lot of them. And the concerning thing is many of those diseases are transmissible to other species. Domestic livestock, pets, wildlife, and even humans. So that's a pretty important kind of thread throughout all of the diseases the feral swine could potentially carry. And we all know that once a disease gets spills over, or once a disease is introduced into a free-ranging wildlife population, it's very difficult, if not impossible, and very expensive to control. much less eradicate. So prevention, if possible, is definitely the preferred. Let's see. Anna already mentioned the foreign animal diseases, so foot and mouth disease is the one that's a really scary thing to think about, that being introduced through feral swine. How would we ever protect our wildlife population from becoming infected? And then if that happened, what would we do about it? So that would impact all of Montana. Everybody would feel the impact if something like that were to happen. Those are most of my concerns. It's just that there are some diseases that people have spent a lot of years and a lot of resources eradicating in livestock, and those diseases still occur in these feral swine in some places. And so to have that potential show up, and I'm always concerned about the risk of a disease spillover into wildlife and that transmission between wildlife and livestock. And I think that we want to do what we can right now to prevent that from happening. If these animals do become introduced in Montana, then we're going to need to focus on disease surveillance as a crucial part of dealing with the problem. So I feel like, feral swine, there's a delicate balance. I also think about how would introduction of feral swine affect transmission of other wildlife diseases like chronic wasting disease. They're going to be changing the way the animals use the landscape. And is that going to change the transmission dynamics of other diseases we're already facing? And at the bottom of the, at the end of the day, our agency role is stewardship, managing for healthy and abundant wildlife populations. And this would make that, add another layer of, complex, logistics to that. So, I guess those are kind of the things rolling around in my head around this issue. And if anybody has questions, I'm happy to try to answer them
Afterwards.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Darby Warner. I'm with the Executive Director of Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation. So you might wonder why Crop Insurance Corporation cares about wild boar. And I think it comes from Ryan's comments about when they were brought to Saskatchewan, it was a diversification option for agriculture. So it's kind of agriculture was responsible for that. And at SCIC, we have a team of predation specialists. So we have a program that helps to control predation on farms if you're suffering losses from predators. And so we had a team dispersed across the province that did that kind of work for us. So we started out, the very first work we did was we did that collaring project with Ryan Powers and Ryan Brooks. We put 5 GPS collars on pigs to use as Judas pigs. So the theory is, like they said, they'll end up with their sounder and then they'll move on someplace else. So you can go in and take out that sounder and try and preserve the collar so it goes on to the next place. Our first 2 hunts, the first one we found them in their pigaloo, as Ryan calls it, and we shot 1 pig in there. It had our collar on it. So that was a total dismal failure. The next one was where we had one of our collars didn't work. It was actually on the animal upside down, so we found it on one of our trail cams. So we went there specifically to take out that animal, and when we took out that animal, we ended up with 2 with orange collars on them. One was Dr. Brooks's collar. So that time we still owe you for that. So we had 7 pigs were taken out, and a total of 3 collars were disrupted. So I would say our first step with that wasn't that successful. One thing about wild boar, they are the piece that makes them the hardest to control is the part that makes them that they can get away with what they do. So, Ryan talks about pigs outnumbering people in Saskatchewan at some point. Most people in Saskatchewan have never seen a wild boar. So we live in the areas where they are, but they're elusive. They're deep in the riparian areas. They like the boreal forest. One project that we do every year, in Saskatchewan, we pay for all wildlife damage that happens in your crop, 100%. So we go back and ground check all those claims, and we go to the areas where wild boar is identified as even a partial cause of loss. Those pigs, they're not active in our agriculture land, so they're staying in the forest. They're eating the cattails, rooting up the tubers in the ground. Even in the winter in 2016, We had 1.6 million acres of crop that remained in the field over winter. That winter, we did some work with the aircraft to find areas where the pigs were out in the crops. We found one field of field peas where there'd been some rooting. Other than that, there was no reports of wild boar damage over winter. So they're finding their food source in the forest and away from the public. So I know that's not true in Texas, where there's $2 billion worth of damage each year caused by wild boar and agriculture land. And what we're finding is that we're not having the same impact in Saskatchewan. The reproductive rates, we've done some work with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. They've done about 100 necropsies on the pigs that we've captured in the last 5 years. We're finding 6 or 7 fetuses in those pigs. In the traps, we're not finding that. So this time of year, we'll have maybe four juvenile pigs in that group. Once we get into the harsh winter part, those numbers are coming down to 1 or 2. So there is some predation, some wildlife, or just the habitat that they're in is causing some of those animals. I know Bob Brickley's team talks about sometimes your best friend is the wild boar, the boar that travels around. So the boar are actually killing the juvenile pigs that are in those groups. So sometimes they can have as much effect on the numbers as a natural predator would have. So in the past few years, since 2015, the program's been with SCIC. We're having pretty good success with live traps now, with Jagger Pro traps, panel traps. We put bait out in the areas. We have a network of trail cams to monitor for pigs. Once the pigs show up, we'll put the bait out. There's been documents written for years already about how you catch a pig. You put some bait out, the pig comes to the pig, you build one side of the fence. Pig gets used to one side of the fence, you build another side until you get the enclosure, and then you got your pig. But that doesn't work with wild pigs. So they'll come to that bait 3 nights in a row, and you won't see them for 3 weeks. They'll be gone, and then they'll show up again. So I said one advantage that we have is the people that we have working at this. They're diligent. That's what they do. But you can't just go out and pick up another 50 people to get them to do that work for you. You have to be the right kind of person. You have to put in the time and the effort to actually make even the panel traps successful. We've had pretty good success with snaring. In Saskatchewan, we get lots of snow. So in the area where the pigs primarily are located, the snow gets deep in the wintertime. They get trailed up, they call it. So once they get their trails, they don't do good in deep snow. So once they get on those trails, you can be quite successful with snares because they don't get off that. They'll stick to the pathways that they have. So that's been a success for us for sure. I would say we have 5 areas of concern in the province with pigs. Southern Saskatchewan is not one of those areas, so the work that Bob Brickley's team has done, I think they considered over the years 5 or 6 times they've eradicated the pigs in that area. But because there's still a source of wild boar, they escape from those farms and then they have to start all over again. So that group's been very successful there. Again, you got to find that group of special people like that that are going to take that on, because you can't just go and hire 5 guys and say do what Bob Brickley did, because that can't happen, right? They've got it in their blood, so those guys are determined to take care of them. So we're expanding we've been doing extensive work in two areas of the province. One area, I won't say we've eradicated the pigs, but their numbers are way down in that area. We're not finding them on our trail cams anymore. We have reports still in a feedlot that's there where they're seeing pigs on and off, but we took 150 pigs out of that area the first year in that feedlot. So there was a major population in that area. Like I said, we're trying to expand that network, but to get those people trained and up to speed, that takes a serious amount of effort. So that's our next piece. So I think when we get some of this infrastructure in place, we can be quite successful in those areas. So we can put those traps out. And like I said, with the areas where the hunting is primarily, so one thing you need to be sure of in Montana, on private land, we can't get access to that. So we're doing some work on the regulatory side to give our people the same rights as a pest control officer, where they can access any land, public or private, to remove the animals. So that's one thing you should take really serious, that you make sure you have access to those animals, because people will have a area they consider their private hunting grounds, and they want those pigs in there, so they won't allow our people in. So lots more to add later in the question period, so thanks.
Okay, who has a question and for whom on the panel? Yeah, go ahead. And I'll probably repeat your question so that it can be transmitted.
Say again?
Go ahead and then I'll repeat your question because of the,
My first question is, have any provinces or states considered instituting a bounty program?
have any provinces or states considered instituting a bounty program? Is that directed to anyone in particular?
Probably, I don't know, whoever knows.
Okay,
I have a little knowledge about this. So Alberta had a bounty program in place. It ran for about 5 years, and they collected a lot of samples. So in order to get the bounty, you had to turn in 2 ears from a pig. I know there was some abuse of that program. Many black ears showed up there, whether it was a tame or a domestic pig or not. So there was some leakage there for sure. I think what it did for them really, it gave them those areas to focus their efforts on. They've done away with the bounty program. I think if you do the literature research on it, you won't find anybody that supports that as a good way of controlling these animals. And Ryan Bucks or Powers can definitely comment on that, I'm sure.
anybody else have anything on that?
I might just,
Rick?
yeah, at least in terms of, wildlife management, there's a long history of trying bounty systems. And the general consensus is that they're just another way of spending money without really having much of an impact. I would assume the same would be true here. It's sort of like an enhanced recreational hunting opportunity.
Did you have a follow-up question?
I did. I noticed in the slides, most of the sounders were associated with aspen clones, and he directed that they were mostly in wildlife. And Saskatchewan has a history of CWD as well, and maybe they're a donor province. But has anybody looked at, can a prion pass through a feral pig, and does that help distribute CWD? It'd be interesting to overlay that map in Saskatchewan.
Can a prion pass through a feral swine? Who wants to take that one? The vets are looking at each other. Jennifer.
I can try, but Anna can chime in too. My assumption would be that they probably, intact prions probably can pass through the GI tract of a pig. I think there have been studies that have shown for other species that's the case. The question is, how big of a role does that actually play in transmission of the disease to a susceptible animal? We don't know what the infectious dose of prions is. So, pigs could move carcasses around, potentially they could ingest them and pass intact prions in their feces. We just don't know what that means to the overall, they do move a long way. So if they could take an effective dose and take it 100 miles or whatever, long distance, then they could potentially introduce it into a new area. But I think relative to the risk of live infected animals, that's probably a much lower risk in the big transmission scheme.
And lastly, Hawaii hunts their wild hogs with hounds. Do any provinces or state allow hound hunting?
Do we know about hound hunting of feral swine? Nick? No.
I don't know.
I know that California did that when I was there, back as a student. I actually went out with some houndsmen to harvest some pigs for disease testing. I don't know if they still do that, but they also, it was very clear that wasn't making a dent in the problem, but that was a tool they were allowing it back then in those days.
Thank you.
Could I maybe add just,
Yes.
I'll add just one tidbit. I haven't fully researched into some of the other methods, but I had heard just last night anecdotally people talking about dangers to hounds actually from hound hunting swine because of how aggressive the swine can be, which is sort of an interesting issue because it had brought up the question to me is thinking about the safety of some of our hunting dogs in upland game bird situations. But just to add one other anecdote about the hunting piece that I had looked up when we originally testified on the bill is the problem apparently in Louisiana and some other southern states that maybe have more liberal hunting rule says they were actually trying to use drones because they disperse so much at night, and so kind of creating really interesting safety situations for hunting. But yeah, they were actually trying to use drones to kind of target them.
Yes, back in the back.
Be a little more specifications on the snare.
Address the snaring more specifically?
Yeah, so we worked with our Ministry of Environment to get the right snares for it. They're a tougher animal to snare because we had the same issue with the collars. They're kind of shaped like a triangle from the back of their ears to the front. So to catch them in the snares, we had to struggle with that at first, but we did get that figured out. So
Do you have the specifications? What type of snare you're using, anchoring system,
I
size?
don't have that. I'd be glad to get it for you though, if you give me your contact information.
Steve?
And just to repeat, those were primarily used in deep snow circumstances, is when you had that kind of a travel pathway that you could.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll post one to Mr. Warner. Did you say that you had a lot better luck in northern Saskatchewan where there was more trees and dense brush and that type of thing, getting a hold on the population, and not so much in southern Saskatchewan? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, no, that wasn't my statement, but I think in southern Saskatchewan, I think the methods they used, it was like they used an aircraft to find the nests, and then they went and took out the animals right in their nest. So I think that was quite effective for them. And they're in primarily boreal forest where that was too. It's in southern Saskatchewan. But my comment was about one area where hunting isn't prevalent, so there's lots of hunting opportunities there. And people weren't primarily hunting wild boar. We're getting a lot bigger sounders, so we're getting larger groups of pigs at one time, and they're a lot easier to entice into a trap. In the area where they're hunted more heavily, the groups are small, and it's tough to get them to come to bait.
Nikki, did you have a question?
I did. Darby, do you have a dollar amount associated with how much is paid out for crop insurance damage?
Is there a dollar amount for Darby that's been paid out?
Yeah, it's shockingly small, less than $20,000 a year.
Thank you.
Okay, let me take.
For wild boar, millions of dollars for game birds and wildlife.
Okay, yes.
So I was wondering if there's actual research on science, like when you did the necropsies on those 100 pigs, did you look at what was in their belly? And also, is your low payout due to low reporting or actual low usage of farm ground?
So the results of the necropsies on
The 100 pigs
what they're eating.
Yeah, that you had taken and said there was like 6 pigs in the litter. So if you necropsied them, did you not also maybe look at the contents of their stomach?
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't involved with that, so it's the Department of Veterinary Medicine that works with Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. So they came out, got those necropsies, and I get the report, it's published on their site, but honestly, for a farm boy from Melford, it's pretty tough for me to understand.
Ryan, did you want to comment on that?
In our animals, we cut open stomachs of those 41 animals in 2017. The stomachs at that point were mostly full of canola. And so certainly our data from stomach contents, from GPS collar data show these pigs use a lot of egg crop.
Okay, Steve?
Well, this is kind of addressing that. It looks like the populations in Canada were kind of really hitting that trajectory around 2010 as far as population growth from the scale I saw. How long have we had feral hog problems in the U.S.? Does anyone know kind of a history as far as generationally what we're looking at? Or we're looking in Canada maybe in 1 decade?
I can take a shot at that. So,
Okay, and will you tell us who you are?
Bill Sparkland, work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services.
Thanks.
So the one idea that we have from the United States is pigs came to Florida in 1539 with DeSoto.
Oh.
The interesting part of that story, and I have this from Dr. Jack Mayer, who has done a lot of research on pigs, is in 1608, the King of Spain issued a decree to the colony in Florida that at that point, they were no longer the king's game, and hunting was no longer restricted on wild pigs in the Florida colony. So for context of hunting as a management tool, it's been wide open on pigs in Florida for over 400 years. There are more pigs there now than there were in 1608. And it's really interesting. I tried to find the document online because he opened up a presentation and a discussion about hunting as a management tool with an image of that decree. And so think about that. You know, the pig problem in Florida was a big enough problem that the King of Spain sat down by candlelight with feather and some scribbling and wrote that out. So just the historical context.
Thank you very much for that.
Well, I appreciate that, and I guess in the other part of the context, that's really a great example, is the impact on agriculture and crops. And so when I hear the crops he's showing canola, and then only 20,000 in an annual basis in damage reports, it seems like a real big gap there where I was thinking if in the US there's been more documented crop impacts that might be more applicable to what the second 10 years of pigs would cause. So anything to speak on agricultural impacts specifically? Maybe another area for research.
Right. This is the I don't know for sure day. Yeah. Okay, and behind Steve? And then
Has anyone done much experimenting with electric fence and these feral hogs? As far as like put a fence around the golf course? Does that kind of keep them off, do a good job, do a bad job?
So the question was about the effectiveness of electric fencing. Anybody know if that's been tried anywhere? Ryan?
Can I add another, like, not cliche, but
Yeah.
I said earlier that what I read once was every calorie or thing with carbon they would eat, but I've also heard a sentence that said any fence that allows water through could possibly allow a swine through it, or a pig, yeah. So it sounds like they do get damaged quite readily by pigs, and that they're more apt to kind of maneuver around them.
Yes.
Question on brucellosis and the different strains. I was reading where pigs can transmit it to cattle, but it's a false positive. So in terms of having brucellosis-free cattle herds or brucellosis-free bison herds, could you comment a little on that?
Sure. So the brucellosis that is commonly discussed within the cattle population, or the or is a concern within the cattle population or the bison population, is Brucella abortus. When we talk about brucellosis in the swine population, we're more focused on Brucella suis. And so there are reports of cattle being infected with Brucella suis, though they're asymptomatic in that the clinical signs that we might see with a Brucella abortus infection is not what we're seeing if a cow is a cow is to pick up Brucella suis. So as far as whether or not, if a cow is to come through the chute and she's to test positive for Brucella suis, what impact that might have on our status, I might have to defer to Dr. Zalewski or Dr. Szymanski.
Yeah, I'll just say that the bulk of the epidemiology for tracing cattle that test positive for Brucella in Texas is associated with the, kind of the transfer with Brucella suis from exposure to swine. So I think they haven't found an actual legitimate case of brucellosis since 2011 in Texas, but yet they're continued to have epidemiological investigations to find out why some of these animals test positive, and then ultimately when they keep digging they find that it's the swine brucellosis rather than from the cow.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I kind of had a question. Brucellosis is a big concern in the GYA in elk. And I wonder if we had feral swine on the landscape that were infected with the suis, how would that affect our ability to do surveillance for brucellosis in elk?
The available, like, serological testing does not distinguish. So
Right.
testing that we do on blood, that we collect from live animals, does not distinguish between suis and abortus. And so if we did have suis on the landscape because of the feral swine, it would complicate our testing for Brucella abortus.
So that would be a big impact for us.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yes?
What keeps wild boar in check in the native range in Europe? And are there, as a follow-up to that, are there any biological control options being investigated?
Amy, Nick?
I can start unless you want to start. Yeah. Do you want me to start? One of the interesting pieces sort of about thinking about the control in Europe, I was thinking about that a little bit, and what it sounds like is, for the most part, the swine that would be the wild swine in Europe, it's sort of that same piece where they evolved along on the landscape so along with their other wildlife and plants, that they actually have the opposite, where there are some instances where animals and wildlife are benefited by the behaviors, and that they're actually seen as a sort of positive ecosystem engineer in Europe. Different plants and seeds that would adapt to maybe being cultivated in those areas. I think someone mentioned at how, the behavior does open up the landscape here for invasives to come in, versus in Europe where it actually would help some native plants take hold. So that's sort of the extent on that side of it. It doesn't seem like there are a ton of natural predators, though we certainly have more in Montana than would be present in the European landscape. But it is interesting that they're actually seen as a positive impact there. So one of the unknowns could be maybe a few species. I could see one or two that actually could benefit, but we may not know what those are yet.
And I've spent time in France and actually seen, wild boar there and had it for dinner, and it's managed just like a valued native game species. And I don't know if they have quite the reproductive rate as these hybrids, or I think Dr. Zalewski might speak to that. But again, they're hunted and managed through a conservation model similar to ours.
Yeah, I was just going to add that something's shifted the dynamics for feral hog, feral swine management or population control in Europe, and that is the emergence of African swine fever, which you may have heard about, has been kind of raging in Asia, but the introduction happened about 12, 13 years ago into Eastern Europe, and there's actually proposals to build a $9 million, I think maybe even $11 million fence along the Denmark border, what they're saying here with a neighboring country, and France was actually considering likewise a border fence for this very problem because of African swine fever. So I think there's certainly much less public land available and much less land that's uncontrolled in Europe. So I think there's some, they don't have quite the ability to prosper and go undetected. By the same token, they seem to be a significant problem and it's a high concern for other reasons, and that's the African swine fever now, and something that we're concerned about in the U.S. as well.
Okay, one more question or comment.
I was just going to add to that comment that, from the literature, wild boar are increasing in their native range too. And this is something you see in the Mediterranean. They never were much of a wetland pest, and now I know there's a lot of control going on. I think Spain is having more issues with them in their tidal marshes and worried about waterfowl. And then the other thing, my wife's from Germany, and pigs are now a nuisance in Berlin. Like, they've moved into cities, they get into trash cans, all the riparian areas in town. I get photos from my sister-in-law. They're at the park chasing kids around to go and drop potato chips. And similarly, you can Google Honolulu, and Hawaii occasionally has the same problem where pigs are moving in, and the same thing, they like to get the trash. So it seems some of the same increase we've seen with feral pigs in this country. There is seemingly an increase in native range as well.
Okay, we need to cut it off and move on, and so thank you. Oh, Ann, did you want to make one last comment?
Just to speak to this about the trash issue, it also brings up a really important vector in African swine fever, is that it can be transmitted through meat products. And then if you are throwing your waste food in the trash, that is a huge issue of concern because chipmunks can pick that up, end up with the disease and pass it along as well. So that's one reason we have, the state of Montana has worked to phase out garbage feeding. And we work to teach youth not to have that practice occurring, just over the trash issue as well.
Okay, would you give a round of applause for our panel?
Okay.
They're all leaving.
I know.
Yeah.
So I think we'll take a very short break because I see people moving out of the room, but we'll get started pretty directly here, so be quick. Yeah.
Oh my
Not cliff, but just roll.
Canadians have lots of
So I'll try to increase the size of it a little bit, but.
Hi,
Nikki, nice to meet you.
It's
the audio that'll get me in trouble.
Yellowstone Public Radio.
Okay.
It's our affiliate for Eastern Montana.
I've seen you hanging up.
This is just one of the background.
I just, my point is,
Crazy
a lot of interest in what's like.
Yeah.
A lot of good questions.
It's really good, yeah. I wonder if we should move this forest.
Hey, let's go ahead and
Hey, you're gonna make me salmon. That'll quiet things down.
Jesus.
I'm not much of a whistler, but you go for it. Awesome. I was ready to sing or whistle, one or the other. Neither of which would be pleasant, so singing probably less pleasant than whistling. So we'll go ahead and take our seats. John Stiber, who is the USDA Wildlife Services head for the state of Montana, is going to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thank you. We're very thankful that we have Dale Nolte here. Dr. Nolte is the USDA Wildlife Services National Feral Swine Program Director. So he's over all of USDA Wildlife Services feral swine work throughout the country, and even some of the other areas and so on. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Dale. Thank you, Dale.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the opportunity to come back to Montana. I was actually fortunate enough to go to Sweetgrass about a month ago, and I was impressed. That many people showing up, from my perspective, kind of in the middle of nowhere, to talk about a topic that, to be honest, in some states where there's a lot of pigs, we have trouble getting people to pay attention at times. So this is a great opportunity. And what I want to do is talk a bit about the national program, but kind of go through a lot of the topics that have already been covered, and some of it given my perspective.
Well, you might have to minimize the.
And this has been talked about in the last group in particular, but why do we care about feral swine? Why did USDA decide to get involved with feral swine? And it's the damages. I mean, there's other issues with feral swine, but if it wasn't all the damages they cause, USDA at least probably would not got involved, particularly damages to agriculture. And they've already been talked about, but to go to some of it, damage to natural resources. The World Conservation Union has called them the world's worst invasive species. They eat 3 to 5% of their body weight every day. So you can kind of imagine the mass they have to go through. Impacts are direct predation on ground nesting birds. We know they've eaten fawns and others. But it's the indirect competitions, all the eating of the food. Down in the south, we're doing some work right now. The mass crops, particularly in lean years anyways, first one like vacuum cleaners, just going through and cleaning it up. Even squirrels are being impacted because they cache them. Feral swine come along and eat all their cache. So the impact of natural resources, something we don't fully understand yet, but every time we look, it seems like it's just getting more and more. The damage to crops. We used to talk about what crops they damaged, and I'd provide a list, but they damage all of them. I have yet to come against up with a crop that somebody doesn't say they're damaging. I was down in a meeting earlier this week in Georgia, and some of the hemp fields are already being impacted. You know, that was something that came out with the Farm Bill. Tobacco's impacted. I thought that was one crop that maybe they wouldn't hit. But I've learned not to say that in some of the southeastern states, because they definitely feel they impact tobacco. We used to say 1.5 billion a year. That was the last number that was published by a man named Pimentel. But as we have gotten in and looked closer and closer, we're thinking this number is at least $2 to $2.5 billion a year. But one of the things we realized, we really don't know. They damage across all sectors. So we've kind of quit saying they damage this much. My job is to reduce that damages, and the more research the number just keeps escalating. So we're trying to get a better handle on that, but let's be satisfied with it's probably at least $2 and $2.5 billion. It's extensive. Damage to pasture and range lands. Feral swine tear up all sorts of infrastructure on farms, contaminate feeds. You know, there was a livestock producer, this is not really pasture land, down in Texas that had problems with feral swine getting into a feedlot and eating his feed. And we went in there and looked at it, and there were damages. There were several $1,000s worth of feed he was losing on a regular basis. But when they looked closer at it, the calves or the animals being fed in the areas where feral swine were gaining about a pound less per day than where feral swine weren't coming in and feeding. That was where the real impact was coming. Predation on livestock. There is some predation. A lot of times it's during parturition, particularly with lambs and kids. But it's fairly common, especially in areas with predation is high. There's already been a lot of talk about disease transmission of livestock. That's a real threat to us. USDA spent hundreds of millions of dollars and decades getting rid of pseudorabies, swine brucellosis, and such out of the domestic swine herd. Feral swine, pseudorabies, it's usually around 18% when we're looking for it. Brucellosis around 6 to 8%. That's high. And so it's a constant threat of reintroducing some of these diseases back into our livestock. Tuberculosis is also something that's worried about a great deal, particularly around dairy farms. Urban property, you see this quite a bit. There's more and more pigs moving into suburban areas or green belts and urban plots. When USDA first got involved with this, our administrator, Kevin Shea, used to like to say, feral swine crossed the line when they started destroying golf courses. The people that controlled the money all of a sudden were impacted. But it's not unusual. People will put in good landscape and, overnight it's just gone. Damage to vehicles. There have been a number of fatalities in the U.S. due to accidents with feral swine. Estimate a while back was about $36 million in damages a year. Hitting a feral swine is about like hitting a 200 to 300 pound rock on a highway. So the accident can be severe. Direct threats to humans, that question has come up today. Fortunately, to the best of our knowledge, there has not been a fatality in the U.S. due to a feral swine attack. There has been around the world. We have had some unprovoked attacks that have hospitalized people, but a lot of the attacks we've seen have been people are doing stuff that kind of generated the response. But it is a threat, and it's one of the worries I have more and more, because we're starting to see this. We're in park areas or suburban areas where feral swine are really starting to associate people as a food source. I refer to them as the garbage dump pigs, because if you remember several decades ago, bear problems coming in to where there were trash cans and people leaving food or feeding them on a regular basis, all the negative interactions that happened. We're starting to see where that situation is more and more likely. A deal where you have piglets underneath a picnic table where somebody's feeding, I can guarantee you there's a mama sow not too far away from those baby pigs. And if somebody were to grab one and it started squealing, it's a huge attractant. And it's going to be nasty. So there is a real fear of what could happen. Disease transmission to humans. We did a study where we went into an abattoir and collected samples from what were feral swine being slaughtered. Brucellosis was in about 10% of them that we detected in serology, but when ARS went back and did culture samples, it was 12%. Our serology test repeatedly give a bunch of false negatives. Leptospirosis is about 50%. We've seen that as high as 70 to 80%. Toxo is 9, trick 3.5, influenza 14, hepatitis, what we saw was about 15, M. bovis. Those results aren't complete yet, but right now it's looking it's going to be 5 to 8%. That to me is a real concern. And Ryan and others did a good job about going through this. You know, feral swine, Suscrufa, for our perception, is any wild pig or any uncontrolled pig out on the landscape. These could be potbelly pigs, they could be escaped domestics, European wild boar. They all follow on to the same situation from our perspective. You know, they were first brought over from Spain, we believe, in the early 1500s. And Spanish explorers, what's been explained to me across the South, they would actually just go through and they'd release piglets or pigs as they went, because they knew they'd survive, and when they circled around, they'd have a ready food source available to them as they came back. And that helped do some of the initial spreading of feral swine down in the Southeast that's been there for centuries. Some of the issues that make them a highly effective invasive species, a lot of people say they're probably the best invasive species possible. If you're going to design an invasive species to be effective, a feral swine is it. They're generalist, they're omnivorous, they eat anything, they're opportunistic, they're intelligent, they breed rapidly, and they adapt to almost any environment. I mean, there's really, they're the perfect animal to put someplace, survive, and repopulate. Little background in the U.S. Back in the 80s, well, I guess that's 82, most feral swine, the populations weren't near as dense as they are now. Most feral swine were down in the Southeast and in California. By now, they've spread through our programs in 37 states. We did have activity in 41 states at one point. You can kind of see how they moved up. And the other thing that I'll point out here is that's not natural dispersion. We believe the vast majority of this is due to humans moving them. And somebody already said this morning, but how fast are they spreading? From my opinion, they're spreading about 70, 80 miles an hour going down the highway. So while you need to be aware of feral swine that are up in Canada that may disperse down into Montana, don't drop your guard across the whole state. Because it just takes somebody with a load of pigs in the back of a pickup to drop them off, and you're going to have an issue, particularly if you don't pick up on it right away. We believe that's where most of them have come from as we get into more of the northern states. But there's also a lot of high fence hunting preserves where there's been some escapees out of those as well. Talk a little bit about the National Feral Swine Program. APHIS, the group I work with, Wildlife Services, is the lead federal agency to address feral swine. But we recognize there's no way of doing this by ourselves. So it's a coordination among many federal agencies, and in particular our interest in every state is to work with state partners, state agencies, tribes, or anybody else that has an interest in addressing this issue. One of the things we did recognize early on is that due to the regulations and environmental conditions, having one plan for how you're going to address feral swine across the nation wasn't going to work. So what we do is we defer to our state directors in Montana, is John Stiver, to work with the state agencies and to develop state-level plans that fit within their goals, their interest, and the environment and the regulations they have. Our overall objective of the program is to minimize damage. That's why APHIS got involved with this, is to reduce damages. But we do feel if populations are low, what we should be doing is eliminating them. So in states where there aren't very many of them, our goal is elimination. Because we can get rid of them, we don't have to keep coming back and mowing the grass. But in other states, down in the southeast where populations are so high, then our primary focus is just to suppress populations to reduce damages. Some of the components of the program, and I want to point out again that Wildlife Service takes the lead, but this is an APHIS-wide program. Other agencies, VS, International Services, are all engaged with us. We have field operations, that's by far the biggest part of the program, but we do monitor for disease, and I'll touch on a little bit of that. We have a research branch. We're a government agency, planning, working with people, developing plans, evaluating, monitoring. The effectiveness is a big part of it. Communication and outreach, and then I'll touch on regulatory actions. Field operations, we've been highly, in my opinion, successful. But it depends on how you define success, because the populations are still showing up in new areas. And we're definitely not starting to see a decrease in feral swine. But there's 4 states, since the program started in 2014, we feel we've eliminated feral swine. Now, I'm going to admit right here, we were picking the low-hanging fruit. We were picking, we were going into states where maybe 3 pigs and saying, all right, let's get them. But if we hadn't, I guarantee you there'd be way more than 3 today. And I also want to give credit to the state agencies. The state agencies, particularly like in New York, was aware of this problem and have been dealing with this way before we ever had a national feral swine program. Wildlife Services was working with them, but the program itself hadn't affected. Detection, those are states that we also feel like we probably eliminated feral swine, but we wait 2 years to see if feral swine can be found during that period of time, because it's so hard, and most of that's public interaction. We can be out looking for them, but it's the reporting of people coming in and saying, we've seen them, and then we go back and look at them. And there are some states, Washington, we moved to detection status back in 15 or 16. It was early on. Every year we find new pigs. We believe every year we go in and take them out. But somebody is helping us out by putting new pigs back in on a repeated basis. And again, though, if we didn't have people there that were being diligent in taking them out on a regular basis, the populations would be much, much higher than they are today. And hopefully this gives you a little hope. If we are capable of getting rid of them if they come to Montana.
What's the North Dakota status for feral swine?
To the, Ryan Powers is here, so I'm going to let you, to the best of our knowledge, there's a tribe there that has some on tribal land, and every once in a while you get 1 or 2 that become reported. We're not down to where we feel they've been eliminated, their detection. Ryan, do you want to?
Yeah, we've been dealing with it since 2007. It's been sporadic reports, statewide. Sometimes we'll go a few months without getting a report, and then we'll get, like in the month of October, we've gotten 4 new feral swine reports, points alone. And so sometimes we can determine where they came from. Sometimes it's escaped backyard pig operations. There's other times that we can't determine where they came from. When pigs end up in the Badlands, for instance, and we can't determine, if they came from a backyard pig operation, then it starts to make us scratch our head and wonder, is somebody dumping them there intentionally, trying to establish a healthy population. So we can certainly talk more about it later, but it's just it's been sporadic complaints since 2007 that we're dealing with. And some of it is tied into this Canada issue as well, with the duration war that showed up in northern North Dakota. I'm speculating, but I'm fairly confident that we've been sharing pigs back and forth across the border between Saskatchewan and Manitoba both.
Yeah, quick question.
Were your removal programs mostly on government ground?
No. The question was, are removal programs mostly on government grounds? And we do a lot on government land. but it's a coordination with landowners, private landowners and government. The bigger the area we've got to work, the better it is. But it would not be effective if we did not also work with private landowners. From a research perspective, one of the things the research branches has been looking at a lot is, can we develop a feral swine toxicant? There's one that has been registered by EPA. It's called kaput. It uses warfarin as an active ingredient. To the best of my knowledge, no state has gone ahead and picked up that registration and is allowing its use in a state. There are some concerns with some non-target issues. Some of the tests we've done, the efficacy has not been as high as we'd like. The other product is sodium nitrite. It's a product that was originally developed in Australia. USDA is involved in trying to do the research that would allow it to be registered. We're making progress. It shows a lot of promise. We did some field trials this summer in Alabama, and the reports I got was they had trouble finding pigs in what were heavily infested areas after they had done the trial. Now, I think that's a lot of wishful thinking. Pigs, I think it was effective. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but I think it is a tool that in areas, particularly with high populations, could be a real benefit. But we're anticipating right now that the earliest that would be available is 2023, before we can go through all the registration processes. And there's a lot of factors where that could slip, so it could easily slip to 2025 before people are comfortable about the non-target effects, the environmental impacts, and it's actually registered. One of the things with the genetic point of view, that we do have an environmental DNA, and that's something that could be helpful in Montana, because they can go in, collect water, and look for DNA of feral swine. So if you're trying to figure out if a pig has been somewhere or not, collecting these samples could be one way of looking for it. And right now, those samples, John Stiver just needs to call us up and say, we've got some samples here we'd like to run, and we'll set it up with the genetic lab and get them in the queue. One of the other things we've developed is a genetic archive of feral swine. And what that's helping us do, and the map in the lower right-hand corner is showing that happens to be Missouri. But it's letting us start getting a handle on how these pigs are being moved, where they came from, what is the genetic background. And even within the state of Missouri, you can tell that's movement by people. That's not natural dispersal of where these pigs are getting. And again, the other thing that could help Montana with, if all of a sudden you have feral swine, we get some samples from them, we can probably tell you, did they wander down from Canada, or did somebody bring them up from Texas? And where how they're getting there. To me, to be honest, a natural dispersal is a concern, but it's these pickup loads that are floating around that really need to be kind of maintained and watched for. We're also, and as I talked about it, we're trying to get a better idea of the economic impacts. It's huge. They impact every sector. So we're really not able to say this is the dollar amount they're doing, because every time we uncover something, there's just something else there that we find they're damaging. But the number's significant. Human dimensions, our focus there has been on how do we talk with the hunting community. There are hound hunters out there that are very adamant about their sport. To be honest, they don't want to get rid of feral swine. That's a value to them they have. But how do we talk to other hunters about the impacts they're having on native species, such as deer, turkey, quail, and get people to understand in the hunting community that feral swine are not a benefit to have introduced. We are looking at some at reproductive inhibitors, but I got mad, our focus has been way more on the toxicants up to this point than reproductive inhibitors. Disease surveillance, every year we collect about 2,800 samples around the country and test them for swine brucellosis, pseudorabies, and classical swine fever. Classical swine fever, it'd be a foreign animal disease. We've never found it. That doesn't really surprise us, but it makes us very happy. Pseudorabies, normally we're going to find in the 16 to 20% radius. Pseudorabies can be lethal to dogs, so when people slaughter feral swine and throw them out there, I mean 20% of them have potential to kill a dog. Swine brucellosis is usually found in about 6 to 8% of them. Some of the other work though that we're doing is the role of feral swine in dispersal of CWD or anthrax. A couple of years ago there was a paper that came out that talked about in a laboratory setting where feral swine, I shouldn't say feral, but swine, domestic swine, had acquired CWD. So we wanted to go in and look to see if that could happen with feral swine and have, there was an area in Arkansas that had a prevalence of about 30% that also had a lot of feral swine. We collected animals from that area. We're still in the process of running through the test to confirm it. I will say that a lot of the findings right now are consistent with it being there. But it would be a significant enough finding that the scientists are wanting to be very careful of how this is expressed. And so the last, what I've been told, confirmatory test is introduce it to mice and a special breed of mice and see if they acquire it from feral swine. But that is just now getting started, and supposedly it takes about 400 days to say it's not there. Anthrax, we're starting to see some areas in Texas that anthrax is showing up. We have no idea if feral swine are causing that, but there's a connection in that the only thing the landowners are seeing different is they started seeing feral swine on their property when they hadn't seen them before they had anthrax. So again, that's something we have a big interest in doing. Not so much across the Canadian border, but across the Mexican border, we're definitely monitoring the movements. And there's regular movements. They got trails beat across the border where they're going back and forth. But what diseases might be moved across the border with feral swine? I will say the Mexican authorities tell us to keep our pigs on our side and we wouldn't have an issue. They give the U.S. all the credit in the world for their problem with feral swine. We are trying to improve our capacity to look at B. suis. Right now, as I said before, the diagnostics do show a lot of false negatives, and so we're hoping we can improve that and have a better handle on it. We are looking at, there's some places on Hawaiian island of Molokai where there was a quarantine because of TB. Feral swine seemed to be the animals that kept it going. So we're trying to get those removed and see if that can be lifted. And we're also starting to look at FAD risk around airports. Because again, your ASF can be carried in meat. It can last a long time. People coming off flights, throwing sandwiches away. It ends up at a landfill, feral swine eating them. We just feel it'd be worth trying to monitor those animals and what's going on there. What I will point out that we do have a fairly good group of people that are looking at disease risk with feral swine. We work with a lot of state agencies on doing surveillance, and if Montana has an interest in doing that, hopefully you never get them, but if you do and want to look at disease stuff, our group would be more than happy to collaborate and help with that. Communication and outreach, we've got a group that puts together outreach posters. Some of the materials I've seen are here and being shared. But we're also looking for opportunities to collaborate again with state agencies. If there is a message that somebody wants to get out, we've got a team that helps put those messages together and produce materials, and we're looking for opportunities to collaborate. Regulatory actions, that is something USDA has not got involved with feral swine. I mean, there are some laws against moving any animal across the borders without a health certificate. But our view is the state agencies that are best equipped and are best knowledgeable for what a state needs and what kind of regulations they want. We do feel shutting down the movement of feral swine is almost an absolute. But we also feel that generally hunting laws that encourage hunting of feral swine are not good for removing feral swine or keeping them out of your state. That eliminating hunting opportunities is where a lot of states have gone to remove that incentive of having feral swine brought into your state. It's that hunting opportunity. If it's not there, even if they release them, you discourage the potential of somebody releasing them. Planning evaluation, we do have a 5-year report that just came out on the program and what we've been able to do. It is online. If somebody'd have an interest in looking at it, be happy to share that. The last thing I want to do is just go through some indicators of what feral swine were. Because to me, across the state, what you need is people looking for signs of feral swine and getting them reported back to the state agencies, back to Wildlife Services, and have somebody go out there and look and remove them as fast as possible. The one good thing about feral swine is they rarely exist in an area without leaving some indication they're there. They're going to cause damages. So rooting, turned up the soil, I mean, something like this is hard to miss. But they will do rubs, on trees, leaving mud packs, creating wallows, particularly in riparian zones. The tracks look a little bit like a deer track that's a little more rounded. Feral swine would be the one on your left. Trails, again, dripping mud, or they will start going down the same areas and create trails, and their droppings. But that's just a brief overview of what we're doing. I will mention that there is a book on feral swine, Invasive Wild Pigs. Kurt Bercotteren took the lead on putting that together. It will come in, it's in press right now. It's supposed to be released in December. I know most of the authors. I've seen drafts of the book. I think it's going to be a great source of information. It covers almost every aspect of feral swine in the different regions and where they're at and probabilities. So that's available if people want it. But other than that, if people have questions, I might be the Canadian version of saying I don't know, but I'd be happy to try. Yes?
Are feral swine and the longhorn tick overlap yet?
Pardon?
Do feral swine and the longhorn tick overlap in geographic area?
I believe there is some overlap. You're sitting there.
With your surveillance testing of classical swine fever specifically, can you comment for the group on, say you did come up with a positive test for classical swine fever, that being a foreign animal disease, how that might differ than if it was detected in a commercial operation as far as the country's status of being positive for a foreign animal disease?
That's a good question. I mean, classical swine fever, as some of these others are, OIE reportable, so we'd be obligated to say we do have it. It's going to cause an impact. Anytime you have an FAD show up in your country, it's going to cause an impact. But what I can talk more about maybe is swine brucellosis, and it's a reportable disease too, and it's in feral swine. But OIE is allowed the US to say they're swine brucellosis free because it's not in our domestic herds and it's monitored that. So I don't know if I'm really getting to what you're after. It's going to have an impact, but so far in some of the other diseases that are reportable that are in feral swine, we've been able to distinguish between being in a wild animal and our domestic facilities. Does that, you might be better, to be honest, addressing this question than me. Does that kind of get it at what you're after?
Yeah, no, it does. There's some pretty severe trade implications of a classical swine fever, African swine fever, but not disease outbreak, and so
You could, my guess, now I'm getting outside of my realm and they're actually recording me here, so it makes me nervous. My guess is you would see a marked drop almost immediately. How severe would be a little bit is how that got interpreted.
Dale, you mentioned that you don't put pressure on states for regulatory review, but you know, our bill passed when a person wanted to release hogs, and the game warden basically had to beg because we didn't have a statute on the books. And so my question is, I'm wondering if your agency would want to encourage stiffer penalties, and secondly, if there'd be potentially a federal bill that might, legislation that could help address this issue of people purposely moving them around.
That's a good question. And I misspoke if I said we don't encourage. We definitely encourage and provide information to states. But we don't tell a state what to do. Our concern with passing federal laws is that it would impact some states. And there has been more and more discussion of that. But like in California, it's a game animal. The state of California makes a lot of money selling hunting licenses. And for the federal government to step in and say, we're going to override that and make hunting illegal in California would have an impact. And so we feel, because we value the partnership we have with state agencies, allowing them to make the best decisions they can on what's best for their state is the right approach. But let me correct if I said that. We definitely believe that every state should pass laws to stop the movement and release of feral swine in their state, unless you want feral swine. We also believe restricting hunting opportunities decreases the interest of having feral swine or somebody releasing feral swine in your state. And unlike Ryan, I'm not opposed to anybody killing, but it's generating those sporting opportunities and people looking to generate that and releasing them. And we're hearing more and more reports of farmers saying, you know, I never had pigs, and all of a sudden I started seeing them, and sure enough, within 6 months, somebody was knocking on my door saying, hey, I hear you got a problem, I'm here to help you. Some of that could be just good citizenship. But we think that a lot of it, the people that's knocking on the door know good and well where those pigs came from. So,
Dale, is there any truth to the rumor that there's going to be a northern wall and
that's outside of USDA's jurisdiction.
Can we talk about that or too soon?
Now, I will say that when I was in Mexico, Mexican authorities thought Trump's wall would help them with our pigs. But they then turned around and said, we're not paying for it. So
I'd love to just follow up quickly on Nick's question about the policy that enabled you to kind of eradicate them in the states where you were able to do that. Did they have hunting laws on their books, or how were you able to, I guess, regulatorily remove them completely?
Most of them did not have hunting per se, but a lot of the states where we've been successful, the populations were extremely low. And to be honest, that's what's great about Montana. You're showing an interest before you've got a problem. In a lot of these states, we've had trouble generating an interest of anybody even saying, why is it an issue? So they didn't A lot of the states where we've been successful so far have not had a lot of the laws passed. We were able to go in and work with the state agencies and get rid of them before it was a problem. They have, a few of them have now gone back and created laws against release of feral swine. But you know, it's hard to catch somebody that lets them go. I mean, you got a few seconds. In Alabama now, they will not let you move a feral swine unless it's dead, because they were getting into too much of this where people were saying they were hauling them to a slaughter facility or that. So they just came out and said, if you got a feral swine in the truck, it has to be dead. Did that touch?
So we probably got to move on.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
In the states where you have eradicated them, what's your primary use? Do you do kennel traps, aerial? What's been the most effective technique, or is there one?
The thing you absolutely have to have is a dedicated staff that will go out there day after day after day, having no success. Panel traps, though, is it's all the techniques. Trapping gets rid of a lot of them. A lot of times the last one or two are taken by a sharpshooter. The last one's pretty well educated. In New Jersey, it took a couple of years, I believe, to kill the last 3. And that was people that went out almost daily looking for them. Helicopters are another tool. I didn't mention that earlier, but can be highly effective in some areas.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, our next section will be another panel focusing on kind of Montana regulations, response plan, as well as the Squeal on Pigs campaign.
So, again, I'm Tanya Szymanski. I'm the Assistant State Veterinarian with the Department of Livestock. And I was just primarily going to walk through our state regulations. Do I advance the slides on my own?
So you just roll this, roll the middle down.
Thank you.
I'll steal these for you. Sorry.
And hopefully, just kind of building upon the conversation this morning, it will kind of explain why our rules are structured the way that they are. So the first thing is how our state law defines feral swine. It includes, it's not genotypic, so it's not just based upon the breed of pig. It's phenotypic, so animals that appear to be living in a wild or untamed state. And so that accounts for animals that may have been released, domestic swine that may have escaped, purposely been released, or just living in a wild state. And then it also includes animals that are contained for commercial hunting or trapping. So we have actually had an instance here in Montana where somebody hauled a group of pigs up from Texas, brought them onto their property, had them in a pen, was intending to feed them up and release them for hunting opportunities. But because we could clearly see what the intent was, we were able to treat those animals behind a fence as feral swine still. Control of feral swine in Montana. Person or state agency authorized by the state or federal government. So at this point in time, that would be Department of Livestock employees, U.S. Fish Wildlife Services, and in limited instances, we might engage Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in that management. One of the other pieces of our state law is mandatory reporting for the presence of feral swine. And so it talks about if you have knowledge of their presence, that you are required to report that to the Department of Livestock. The one instance where there is some allowance for control of feral swine without immediate reporting is a private landowner or somebody who has leased land that sites is able to observe feral swine on their land, they have the ability to eradicate those animals, to shoot those animals, and then they're obligated to call and report that to the Department of Livestock. Again, that's limited to landowners and people that have leased land that they see feral swine on. Mandatory reporting. Again, it's just must be reported within 24 hours to the Department of Livestock. One of the things that we've struggled with certainly over the years is those reports come in through multiple different channels. It may be hunters in the field that are reporting it to a game warden. It may be somebody that sees them and calls John Steiber and reports them. It may be a Craigslist posting that our office is made aware of. And so they come in through such different channels. One of the things that we've really worked hard at over the last 5 years with the department is a partnership with all of the other agencies that are involved in this, so that as those reports come in, we have a really consistent and defined way of how that information should be disseminated, so that the key people that need to be aware are made aware. And then the big one, what are the prohibited things as far as feral swine are concerned in the state of Montana? So anything that's related to expanding their range or associated with hunting of feral swine is prohibited. Importing, transporting, possessing, assisting with those things, intentionally feeding feral swine, profiting from the release of them. In addition to all of these prohibitions that we have on the book, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks also specifically states that Eurasian boar, Russian boar, and crossbreeds of those are prohibited species, so you're not allowed to import any of those animals into the state of Montana. And then the last big piece of our of our code is the penalty phase. So it's similar to the bucket biologist that Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has, where people want to move fish from one lake to another to create fishing opportunities. It's associated with really stiff penalties, and so are penalties associated with introduction or spreading or expanding the range of feral swine in the state of Montana. Match those and are very stiff fines. So you can see at least $2,000, not more than $10,000 for each violation. And then Dr. Zalewski already mentioned this morning, but just the cost, so that it's not the Department of Livestock that's exclusively bearing that brunt. Certainly Wildlife Services, and John can speak on that here shortly, would have some funding available to help with control, but we can go into general fund as well. Oh, that was it. I had a really short presentation. So with that, I guess I'll open the opportunity for Dr. Zalewski to jump in regards to the existing rules on the books, and then I'll close and turn it over to my counterparts.
Yeah, thank you. Probably the one thing I think that's worth mentioning, if we knew in 2014 what we know now, we probably would not have allowed the initial take of feral swine by a landowner or a leaser of land, because we just did not have that information that these animals scatter significantly and potentially are much more difficult to kill once they're initially shot at. And so the way we're interpreting that right now is that the landowner, if they, the idea was that if they see 2 or 3 animals and they can shoot them right away, they can get rid of the problem right off the bat, and then it wouldn't cause a need for a larger kind of event. And then beyond that first time, if a landowner chooses to exercise that right, that's basically hunting. So even as it's written right now, the way that we're interpreting that, if you have your one shot before you report those feral swine, anything after that, it's illegal even for the landowner or for the leasee, because there's basically, again, because we're defining that under hunting. If we're going to do that, if I had the chance to do it this over again, we would probably get rid of that initial sighting, shoot on sight. And I think we really have to balance the issue about whether we go back to the legislature and take a law that's really, really strong and say we need to fix just a little bit of it, and then potentially take the risk of actually weakening it through the committee process and the public process, or whether we just take well enough alone and we say we have a pretty dang good law right off the bat and we move on. So I think that's kind of the analysis that we might have to look at as we go forward over the next 12 to 18 months prior to the next legislative session. So thanks, Dr. Szymanski, I appreciate that.
I guess the last piece that I'll say before I turn it over is certainly there's, I think that since this discussion has come to the forefront and there's been so much publicity and increased awareness about the feral swine issue, is the question keeps coming back to why does the Department of Livestock, the entity that has the responsibility for it? And I think that, again, in that partnership in the initial bill writing, Dr. Zalewski mentioned that we didn't want it to be within Fish, Wildlife, and Parks purvey. Certainly if an interest develops or if you have that the interest in hunting that develops, it's hard to counter that. And so by having it within livestock, there's not that same opportunity for sportsmen. And then also, I think the other piece is because they don't always come in the fashion that I think everybody has been so recently made aware of, where we have reports of swine on the northern border and potential incursions into Montana as they come down through drainages. Certainly that's where we have engaged Wildlife Services for those response. They're out doing surveillance, they're out talking to landowners, trying to make them aware, see if they've had any sightings of them. But also we have instances where we have hunters that report them. And in most of those instances, we've been able to send a brand inspector out. Those brand inspectors are able to determine if those animals are actually owned and may have just escaped and get them back to the correct owner instead of kind of a shoot on site policy. And then the third situation is the one I mentioned earlier where they're being intentionally brought into our state. And those are instances, again, where we've used our brands enforcement to go out and handle those. So that instance that I talked about earlier, we went out, identified that they were in fact feral swine that had been brought in from Texas. Those animals were slaughtered for human consumption, and we were able to make sure that didn't become a problem in Montana. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Wildlife Services.
All right, thank you. Yeah, again, my name's John Stiber. I'm State Director for USDA Wildlife Services in Montana. I wanted to recognize a couple other people, other than Dale Nolte, who's our National Feral Swine Coordinator, and then Ryan Powers is a District Supervisor for North Dakota. He came over. He has some good feral swine experience, but I've also got a couple of other Montana folks here. Dalen Tidwell is our District Supervisor for Eastern Montana. He kind of supervises all the operational work on the east side of Montana. And then Jerry Wiscombe, he's our wildlife disease biologist, so he's worked very closely with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and so on a number of different disease issues and continues to and so on. So also I wanted to give a big shout out to our partners in this thing. Montana is well situated to deal with this issue. Mainly because of our strong relationship with our partners. We work very, very closely with the Department of Livestock, and we've got an MOU with the Department of Livestock, and we talk nearly every day and so on a number of different issues, and also our relationship with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on all the different work that we do as far as working together as well, an MOU that we have with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and so on. One thing to point out, I guess, is that we are not the regulatory part of USDA, so we have no regulatory authority, and we don't want it. So we rely heavily on the states that have that regulatory authority, like Department of Livestock and like Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and so on. One of the issues that was discussed was working on private property and so on. We do not have the authority to work on anybody's private property that doesn't want us there. We have agreements. On every piece of private property that we work, we have agreements. I guess we don't call them agreements anymore. They're work initiation documents that give us authority to work on that property for whatever the problem is. And typically, most of our work is predator damage, predator conflicts. But one thing that we're doing to be proactive is when we're renewing these agreements, particularly up on the High Line, we're starting to ask our specialists when they renew those agreements to add feral swine so that we're ready to go. because otherwise we have to go out and get those agreements signed. So that's something we'll probably be doing with some of the stock growers meetings and so on, and with our specialists and so on, is whenever we renew those agreements, we're going to add feral swine to it already. And the methods, the control methods that go along with that, so that we're more proactive in being able to do that work. We've got agreements on thousands of ranches in the state already, but again, it's not for feral swine, it's for coyotes and grizzly bears and wolves and so on. So, but that's something that we probably need to do. So feral swine at our northern border, we're kind of in the same shape that North Dakota is. We've got feral swine just across the border. Let's see, how do I work this thing?
Just roll down on the mouse.
Okay. All right, I'm not going to go into this. This has been covered. The pigs are very prolific. I mean, we don't have them here, so we're considered one of the have-not states, which is a good thing. But in my career, I've spent a good deal of time with Wildlife Services, well over 30 years. I spent 11 years in Texas, which is infested. My wife has a ranch in Texas, which is infested. So I've seen the issues firsthand. The competition with livestock, at your creek feeders and different feeders, pigs can become very aggressive at the feeders and so on. Damage, hay bales, all kinds of damage in those areas. And I spent about 8 years in Oklahoma, which is also infested with feral pigs. And I spent some time in California, where they are a game species, and huge issues there, not only with agriculture and in the Central Valley, but also with nesting birds. California has a lot of endangered ground nesting birds. Big problem with pigs all around the Bay Area and the coast and so on. So, I'm not going to spend any more time on this, other than their biology is a big problem. We've talked about this before, but this, in every state that I've been that has pigs, the problem is hunters transporting pigs illegally and dumping them on ranches and expanding that range. And that's why I've got to give a huge shout out to the state legislature for being proactive, and all the people that supported that bill here in this room, because Montana statutes on feral swine is one of, if not the most restrictive state statutes in the country, period. And to be proactive and try to keep the incentive for hunting away was very forward thinking, and I know there might be a few tweaks that could be better, but it's a good law. I mean, it's a very good law compared to these other states where it's just an absolute disaster. So eradication methods, was that the next one? Missed it. We're the agency that's tasked with wildlife damage management, and most of our work here is predator damage management, but I think we're well positioned to assist with the feral swine eradication, keeping feral swine out. Methods such as aerial shooting, ground shooting, corral traps, snares. We would have to gear up on some of these things like corral traps and snares and so on, but as far as the other methods go, we're well versed and well ready. One of the things that is happening in a lot of states, and we're positioned to do these are some pictures that we've taken here, is UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, for doing assessments of damage and so on. And this is actually something we're starting to do already, looking at grizzly bears doing more damage to crops and assessing damage to crops and so on. But drones are just a really neat method to get above the area and look at the area, assess the damage, see where there's problems and so on. So this is something that we'll probably be involved with. We're also very, very lucky to have a good deal of aerial resources, probably one of the most well-equipped states in the country. And part of that is because of our relationship with the Department of Livestock and the ability to use 2 of their aircraft. The 2 aircraft, the one in the upper left and the one in the upper right, are both owned by the Department of Livestock. And we have, and through our MOU, we fly both of those helicopters. One's in Helena and one's in Billings. And the Department of Livestock, through the livestock per capita tax, provides funding for some of the flying of those helicopters. And then the helicopter in the middle is our USDA helicopter. It's out of Billings. And this was a hand-me-down from the Border Patrol. The Border Patrol was one of those have agencies that has a lot of money. They went out and bought a whole new fleet of helicopters, and they gave us their old helicopters, and we were happy for that. So, you know, helicopters, all the parts are timed parts, so you're constantly replacing parts, but you can fly helicopters for a long time. And these helicopters have been extremely effective in the work that we currently do and the work that we do in southern states now for feral swine and so on. And then we have got 2 Super Cubs, both USDA owned, one in Helena and one in Billings, that we've also used. And those are actually the aircraft that we did the surveys up in Frenchman Coulee and some of that country up on the border already. And we'll do more surveys this winter. Once we get good snow cover, we'll do some surveys up there, probably with airplane, but we may even use a helicopter if we really need to you know, scour an area looking for any sign of feral pigs. But you like to wait for a good snow cover, or at least some snow cover, because it certainly opens up an area. It makes it much more difficult to miss anything, as those of you in the room that have done surveys and stuff know that. So, whoops. We also have contract aircraft in various areas of the state. We've got 3 Super Cubs that are contracted. One in Turner, which is a really good area to have it because of where we think we're probably going to get feral swine in. It's right up next to the border. These are all private pilots that we have contracts with to do flying. We inspect their aircraft. We have check rides on their pilots. The pilots are trained by USDA for this type of work. We have an aviation training and operations center in Cedar City, Utah, where we train all of our pilots, including contract pilots, and all of our crew members. So we also have a full force of trained aerial crew members that are trained to do lethal control out of helicopters and airplanes. You know, some of the states are starting to do this on their own, private people doing this. That's dangerous, because you're basically doing everything that a pilot's taught not to do. You're slow and low. And that's what pilots are taught never to do, to be safe. So there is some risk, but our pilots are trained to do that, and our crew members are also trained. Corral traps with multiple capture doors are a big method of doing that. Of course, you have to do a lot of pre-baiting, get the pigs to come into bait. The traps are actually set with the doors open to try to encourage you know, the pigs to come in. Different styles of corral traps that we use in different states. And now a lot of them are remote monitored, and they can be monitored and triggered from a cell phone. So you could basically watch to see. Feral pigs are very intelligent, so if you drop the door when some of the pigs are outside, those pigs are going to remember that, you know, and they're much less likely to go into that trap. So you want to pre-bait, and you want to get as much, if not all, of the sounder to go into the trap before you drop the door. But you could do that from your cell phone if you have cell coverage and stuff. So you could basically watch to make sure you've got all the pigs in the trap. And if you don't, there's another day. You know, just keep baiting until you can get all those pigs in there again. They didn't have this when I was in Oklahoma. You had to go out and check the trap every day, and you know, you'd have these doors where they have to root under to go in. So every pig would basically have to go through the door. Now, where you could do these drops remotely and stuff, this is pretty cool stuff. Kind of above my level of technological expertise, but nonetheless, some of our guys are well versed in stuff. Coming into the trap, when you pre-bait pigs, they come in a hurry. I've been at you know, in Texas, they use deer feeders and stuff and so on. And well, when you go out there and you clang on the feeder, most of the time what you have is a whole herd of pigs that come running into the feeder and stuff. Pre-bait works on pigs. And you could fill up the traps, you know, with pigs. And then we talked a little bit about foot snares, and you know, our guys are trained to use foot snares and neck snares, which are kill type snare. But in fact, some of our guys have developed foot snares and so on that could be used at, you know, where there's where pigs are traveling, and you know, snow helps, of course, but you certainly don't have to have snow. This is down. You can see this picture was way down south. So that's basically what I had. I just wanted to basically talk about our plans and our ability to help with the problem and a willingness to take on this, train people. We're going to be sending some of our crew members down to Texas this winter to get some experience. Some of our folks like Jerry and Dalen already have experience working with feral pigs. So we're not coming into this blind. You know, we've got all these other states that have done this. I think Texas is killing 30-some thousand pigs a year, and so on. So a lot of these states have a lot of experience with feral pigs. Yes, sir.
What's the coordination role or activity of the Border Patrol that's active on the Canadian border? Do you coordinate with them, or how does that work?
Yeah, we work with the Border Patrol all the time. Whenever we're flying close to the border, it's a good idea to let the Border Patrol know. So our pilots know the Border Patrol folks very well and stuff, and communicate with them. We've also talked about them because they have all kinds of monitoring systems along the border and so on, and we've talked to the Border Patrol, particularly along the High Line, because they've got cameras and motion sensors and different stuff at different areas and so on. So we talk with the Border Patrol regularly on that if they've seen any sign of feral swine as well. So,
is there any kind of a formal thing, or is it more informal?
It's more informal. Yep, it's more informal. You bet.
What do they do with the carcasses if they're killing 30,000? Where do those go?
They're most of them are left in the field. Yeah. Yep. And yes.
So if they're killing 30,000 pigs in Texas, is that more than the rate of reproduction?
Oh no. Texas is one of those states where we're just trying to reduce damage. You know, when I got to Oklahoma was the #1 producer of Spanish peanuts down on the Red River. And the farmers had completely given up. They could not, it's an expensive crop to plant, and they had given up. And we made a concerted effort to go down there and reduce the population of pigs, and they're back up there at #1 producer of Spanish peanuts again. But we do use non-toxic shot with pigs on that. So that's an issue, would be an issue with leaving that many carcasses out there. So.
Back to the border question. If a vehicle arrives from a customs station and there's live pigs on board, is that anything that those custom agents are coordinating with you, or is that a Department of Livestock?
That would be a Department of Livestock.
And
something, coordination there.
So, coming from Canada into the United States, so there's only a few border crossings where live animals can come across, and they would have to present, and we actually have someone here from USDA that might be able to flesh out my answer a little bit more, but they would have to present to one of the border crossings that accepts live animals, have those animals inspected, and make sure that they have all of the appropriate documentation to come into the United States. So that, in theory, shouldn't be a route from Canada.
Thank you.
Good. It's still morning? Yeah. It's been a long morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm Stephanie Criswell, the coordinator of the Montana Invasive Species Council. We are an all-taxa council that was created about 5 years ago to be a coordinating body in Montana and the region for invasive species issues. So I just want to recognize our chair, Bryce Christians, and also our AV guy this morning. We also have some members here. Our vice co-chair, Steve Wandrus, represents the conservation districts. Steve Terrell is here. He represents the ag industry. Bruce Anderson represents private landowners in Montana. Is that it for full-fledged members? And then we have our federal agency partners, and Wendy Bellman, there's with BLM, Bill Sparklin with U.S. Fish Wildlife Service, and I think, am I missing anyone? I don't think so. And so how this issue became on our radar was through our partners, USDA-APHIS, Gary Adams, the state plant health director. And he's out there virtually. Hi, Gary. he brought this issue to our attention, and we started getting on the notification list. And so when there's sightings near the border, Ryan Brooks would alert folks, and MISP would get those emails and notifications. So we started partnering with this group of feral swine enthusiasts, and really started becoming concerned. And there's a loose-knit group of invasive species coordinators in the West who meet regularly to talk about different issues. That group is now going to be formalized thanks to Western Governors Association. Bill Whitaker, they're going to now bring this group and formalize it into Western Invasive Species Council, so that's really exciting. But at any rate, we meet every month and we would talk about our different issues, and I was talking about feral swine and saying, you know, we've been getting these things closer and closer to our border. We've had some sightings that haven't been verified, but you know, what the heck do we do here? And our partners say, oh yeah, we've been through this, and I'm particularly speaking about the state of Washington, the state of Idaho, and the state of Oregon. And they had banded together, and I don't know when, I'm thinking about 2015, maybe a little earlier than that, to develop this Squeal on Pigs campaign. One thing that we do across the region and hopefully nationally more and more is having consistent campaigns for different issues. So for aquatic invasive species, the Clean Drain Dry, a lot of people have those lanyards on. We also have a Don't Let It Loose campaign, which is about letting loose aquarium pets. We are in the process now of developing one called Be a Wise Ash, and that's about education regarding the emerald ash borer. So they had told me that they had created this Squeal on Pigs campaign, and you know, have at. So I met with Livestock and Tawny, and she thought it was a great idea and something that we should roll out here. So for the past probably year or so, we've been working together on several aspects of this. One was a rapid response plan, one is the notification list, and then the other component, which the council has been really involved in, is the education and outreach piece. So I think I've kind of covered this first slide for the most part, but we want to reach multiple stakeholder groups, industry groups. As I think Dale noted, this kind of affects everyone. So we're trying to reach out to everyone by distributing the materials across the state, and also educating landowners about the issue. We've started to talk to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and their hunting folks to get them up to speed as to what's going on. And then hosting the summit was a big priority for the council. So what this looks like, we have some of the materials, and you've seen them out in the lobby, I hope. I think most of them or a lot of them are gone. But if you'd like any, or you'd like the graphics so you can do a bulk printing yourself, please contact me. So we have the posters, we have a fact sheet now, which I think is pretty much in final form. We have the stickers, a couple sizes. Oh, this is my old slide. I didn't get the updated PowerPoint, but we are developing a new website, invasivespecies.mt.gov, which is sort of a portal to all things invasive. And one of the pages on there is the different campaigns, like Don't Move Firewood, Clean Drain Dry, Squeal on Pigs. And I did have the Squeal on Pigs screenshots, but they didn't make it here, sorry. So that's going to be launching by the end of the year, I'll say. And then we also, one of the things that we're currently working with our partners on is an invasive species K through 12 education packet. This had originally been done through Ag in the Classroom, and we ran out. So partners got together to do a reprinting, and as we've done that, we've noticed there's some new species that we needed to add, feral swine being one of them. So that's the card. There were some this morning, but I think they're all gone. And it's just one piece of a larger packet. So if you're interested in K through 12 curriculum stuff, please let me know. Or Chantel Frame-Martin with the Montana Noxious Weed Education Campaign is here as well, and she was one of the leads in the beginning developing that. Wrong way. And again, I just wanted to point out again that the USDA's materials, they have a don't stop, or stop feral swine. Don't not stop them, stop them. And they have, this is a list of all the materials. Some of them are out there, and it's really easy to just go to their website and order them up, and they'll just send them to you for free. So wanted to mention that as well. And lastly, just wanted to give you a snapshot sort of where the council is. We're all over the state. This is a really busy time for conventions and conferences. But you can see all the different places that we'll be at with these materials in coordination with our partners at Livestock, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and Department of Ag, and others. So I think that's it. Thank you.
So I think we have lots of time for questions and discussion right now, and I'm going to steal first chance. And with a question for Marty and Tani regarding the statute. In your presentation, I remember seeing somewhat broad rulemaking authority, and I was wondering if the small fixes that you had identified would fall under that. And kind of along the lines of that same question, it seemed like the statute is really focused on management once we have them. And I was curious if you would interpret that statute and that management priority as including monitoring prior to seeing pigs or feral hogs in Montana.
I think I'll address a couple of things, and then Dr. Szymanski made some, was kind of the lead on developing some of the rulemaking authority, which really we focused on reporting. I think I have one concern regarding the statute regarding the taking, that initial taking of feral swine by a private individual who either owns land or is leasing the land. That's straight up in the statute. I don't see how we have rulemaking authority to overrule that. So I think that's just part of it's baked in. Relating to the response versus monitoring, I think you're right. I think the statute does focus on that initial introduction, but I don't think that we need statutory authority to monitor and look for feral swine, right? So I think that goes under the purviews of the agencies that are part of the problem or that are part of the solution. But I will say that all those prohibitions that Dr. Szymanski showed, those are as far as preventing the expansion, preventing from profiting, all that stuff. I think that goes very much not just into a response, but also in prevention. So I think that they do hit really strongly on prevention because of all those various activities that are listed. I do want to just give a shout out to Quentin Kujala in particular, the Chief of Wildlife at FWP, who really we worked very closely with on developing this the draft for this bill, and you know, he recognized that it's probably that it's of great value to have this statute in the Department of Livestock Code rather than Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, just for that very reason that we have an agriculture and livestock constituency rather than a hunter advocacy constituency. So I thought that showed very, very strong foresight. I don't know, Dr. Szymanski, you want to talk about the rulemaking that you were.
No, I mean, ultimately, the one piece of rulemaking that we've done is to put some sidebars on the reporting requirements, time, and how that should be reported, and that we are responsible for notifying kind of the other entities within the state that have a vested interest in management of feral swine. I do think in regards to the surveillance piece, I think that's where the partnership with the Montana Invasive Species Council and just really fleshing out what a response program looks like, who our stakeholders are, having something that we can put out in front of the public as far as education has been a really beneficial thing. I think all of that is serving to increase the statewide surveillance as people are made aware of it. I do think, knowing what one of the presentations is this afternoon, I don't know that we've ever interpreted our regulations to go so far as, you know, some of the more intense surveillance systems, I guess I would say.
I guess I'll moderate this.
Do you have a mic?
Yeah, I think
okay.
I have a mic. Kate, could you grab that mic up there? And then I'll repeat the questions for now. So, did you have a? Go ahead.
I was
just wondering, right now we see where herds of elk might be above what they need to be in certain areas, but there's still landowners who kind of harbor them. And I was concerned where John spoke to the fact that they only do control in the areas where they have an agreement. What would happen if there's a landowner who decides not to cooperate? Would our laws then reach out to them as possession, or how would we deal with that? Because I can see where there could be people who would definitely harbor wild pigs.
Okay, so the question was related to the agreements that John had mentioned that Wildlife Services has with private landowners, and if there was a landowner that was not willing to sign one of those agreements, and if our laws would cover that kind of scenario. So I guess it's kind of a question for both Tani and John.
Yeah, our laws would allow us, as Department of Livestock, to get on that land and control feral swine. So that would not prevent us, whether or not with our authority we could engage Wildlife Services to be active in that. That's John's.
I'm assuming we could, under the authority of the Department of Livestock. And the law is pretty strict about knowingly harboring pigs and so on. So I'm assuming we could under your authority. We've got an MOU. We might have to tweak the MOU some.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have a quick question regarding tribal lands. We've discussed state laws. My understanding is sometimes they don't apply to the reservations in the state. Is there any way to have an outreach to them? Do any of these actually apply there?
Yeah, okay. So the question was regarding tribal lands and whether or not the same types of authorities that have been passed through the state legislature would apply, or if potentially agreements are signed with tribal nations through Wildlife Services.
Yeah, we've got MOUs with all of the reservations except Rocky Boys. We do a lot more work on some of the reservations than other, like CSKT and Blackfeet, Crow. Some of the reservations we do less. Some we just do a certain type of work for them. But we do have a relationship with those tribes, and we do have current MOUs with all the reservations except Rocky Boys.
But do state laws apply here?
Our state laws pertaining to feral swine would not apply on reservation land. And I think that's where, again, coming back to the Montana Invasive Species Council, there is a lot of tribal participation in the Montana Invasive Species Council, and so that's something that looking forward, I think generally speaking, they are all in agreement. I mean, they don't want them any different than we do, so.
Yeah, every tribe has a spot on the council, and at this point in time, we only have 2 vacancies, so very active participation. So we could have a summit with them or something, which we've done before, to focus on tribal issues related to invasive species. Certainly do something like that.
Steve?
So the relationship with the Border Patrol Service, you mentioned they're a HAV agency with funding, and they've got technology that might really come to bear on this as far as border incursions. Would it benefit to formalize that relationship in an MOU with the state, or where do you see that going, the state interacting with the Border Patrol?
I think it would benefit. I think it would benefit the state to have a discussion, a more in-depth discussion with Border Patrol. Yeah, I mean they regularly fly the border, and they've got a lot of surveillance technology that we certainly don't have. Yeah, I think it might be a benefit. You know, the pilot world is a small world, so most of the Border Patrol folks that we deal with are their pilots and stuff, our pilots with their pilots and so on, to make sure we stay out of trouble. I think it would probably benefit the
No,
state.
I think it would, and there's, we do have contact with the Border Patrol through their agricultural specialists, and I think that would be maybe a good inroad as far as expanding that conversation when we talk about invasive species and things entering Montana that could potentially damage our agricultural industries in the state. I think that's.
Is there any concern if we leave the carcasses out, that if pigs are eating pigs, I think about the bone meal that they were feeding to the cattle, that they can develop some kind of a disease that would be a terrible thing? I mean, that's just something I'm wondering about.
Yeah, no, so that's a fair question. So the cattle feeding, the question was in regards to leaving swine carcasses out when they are eradicating them, is there any concern about if other pigs are feeding back on the pigs, similar to what happened in Canada with BSE or mad cow disease? So those are pertaining to what we call the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. TSEs, CWD is one, mad cow disease is another one. To my knowledge, swine are not susceptible to any of the TSEs, so I don't think that that's an issue again, but with, as ongoing research with CWD, who knows what we'll learn, so.
What are the penalties for breaking these state feral swine laws?
Yeah, so it's primarily monetary penalties, so it's a minimum of $2,000 per offense, a maximum of 10, and then also if the department has to mount a sizable response to control that, they would be responsible for paying for that, our time and efforts to control it.
It just recently struck me that I may be the only academic in the room. So if I was giving grades out, I'd give you guys an A+. It just seems like everything you're saying and doing is just exactly spot on. The one thing I will, more of a comment than a question, is the role of academia. I think the universities have a real role to play in all of this. If it's it's a little bit hard to GPS collars pigs you don't have, but in terms of human dimensions research, I think there's huge opportunity here in the state to look at the human dimensions side, habitat modeling to look at potential for, where would pigs most likely to establish. There's, I think, a whole bunch of research type questions, and certainly one of the roles I often seem to find myself playing as a tenured professor is speaking truth to power and having this ability that I can go to the media and say whatever the damn ass hell I want, and I have that freedom to do that, and I take that responsibility very, very seriously, because I think that is a role that, certainly in my world, very, very few people in government can just go in front of a camera and say, what they think. There have to be pretty careful messaging, whereas I have that ability, and I do. That's a role I feel that I have to play in Canada for sure.
So my question is, are there any bases that we don't have covered yet? For example, state land, federal land, state parks, federal parks, any of the reservations that may not want to cooperate, Forest Service land? Do we have any holes in the state that won't be addressed with this?
We do annual work plans with the BLM every year, and so that could certainly be addressed through our annual work plans and annual meetings that we have with BLM. State lands would probably be something that we would, DNRC and so on. The unknown is the tribal land, because, tribal governments changed fairly regularly and new folks in there, councils, so on. That's probably maybe the biggest unknown at this time. We work a lot on CSKT and the Blackfeet, but less so on Fort Peck and Fort Belknap when we're talking about the area where we're probably likely going to get pigs, and so on. So that's probably the one area where continued conversation would be good, and it sounds like the council would be the one to kind of help with that.
Mm-hmm.
So just to follow up on that, where do we stand with the National Wildlife Refuges?
That might be a question.
Yeah, could you just clarify the question a little bit, or?
Well, what if we get pigs on the CMR?
From what I can speak to the refuge system, we would absolutely cooperate with the other agencies, MISC, state and federal agencies, and we'd want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. And we've brought up the pig issue with our sort of prairie refuge managers. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago. We had a meeting in North Dakota with the Montana and the Dakota refuges and gave a presentation on this. Ryan Brook and Ryan Powers came down and talked about the work they had. So we're aware of it. People are looking for it. They know to contact me, and then from that point, I let the council know, and would go from there.
Doing work on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or refuges is something we commonly do for protection of, say, listed threatened and endangered species and so on. So in fact, we have a number of cooperative agreements where Fish and Wildlife Service even provides us with funding to help with protecting endangered ground nesting birds in particular, but also reptiles and mammals and all kinds of stuff. So that's pretty easy to do through an interagency agreement. We do those all the time in different states.
Regarding private lands, what are the authorities or restrictions for conducting the various types of surveillance? Do you have to have an agreement for that? Or what are the authorities or restrictions?
Yeah, it would be, you could fly over, of course you could fly over the land as long as you're so high, and I don't know what our pilots are more at, they know all that kind of stuff, but they can fly over land and, survey from a certain so many feet. Maybe Fish and Parks might know that better than I do, I don't know. But as far as doing surveys go, we could do surveys, we just can't, we can't do any removals on those that land.
John, just clarify, so there isn't any height restriction. The only rules are FFA, and it's only when you create damage to property. So as long as you don't run livestock through a fence or cause some kid on a horse to get bucked off, you can fly as low as you want. So whether it's an ultralight or fixed wing, doesn't matter.
You might just have some hunters that might be giving you different kind of motions.
Really hard to enforce.
USDA through FSA has GIS maps that they survey every year for crops. And do you have specialists that you can draw those blow those maps up big enough to see a pickup? Could you also detect feral swine damage?
I'm guessing you could certainly identify damage, at least some type of damage where you could go out and do it, look at it on the ground. Boy, that's getting out of my, area as well. Interestingly, I mean, we're getting more reports on grizzly bear damage to crops and stuff. So that's something that's probably something that's going to be, it is an increased awareness in the state. But I don't know, Dale, the other states, have they used that kind of stuff for assessing damage, or I'm not sure.
They can tell where you hit it. They can tell the damage has happened. The differentiating what animal caused it is a little more difficult.
And a comment, not a question. I would laud the department for their statute on the anti-hunting provisions and the anti-profiting provisions. I have much less confidence in the anti-movement, animal movement rules.
I think the provisions are, I would just say that I think the provisions are really strong. I think it's the enforcement and recognizing that, people can get in a pickup truck, tow a trailer and move with very little, oversight or I think that's the shortcoming. And I'm not sure that there's a way to mitigate that particular part. But I believe that the regulations that the legislature passed are actually quite strong in that regard. So I agree with you. Enforcement is the key, but I think the laws on the books in that regard are fairly strong.
I think it's hard to emphasize the degree of that issue in those southern states. It's rampant, and wherever there's an incentive to hunt, because in some of these southern states, their hunting lease prices depend on if they have feral pigs or not. If they were feral pigs, they could charge more for their hunting leases. So the incentive is strong to get feral pigs. It's a strong incentive where they don't have laws against it, or where it's not. If there's an incentive for hunting anywhere, that incentive to move those pigs is strong incentive for these people to get pigs into new areas and so on. And it's just, having worked in some of those states and seen it, it's unimaginable, the incentive and the degree to which it happens in those states. Amazing.
Maybe just a comment for the campaign. Really glad to see it. I've worked on the High Line for quite some time. We've been talking with Saskatchewan for a lot of years about this. And now having this kind of a front, a campaign to reach out to landowners and hunters is great. One thing that we see just interacting with hunters and landowners is the desire just to address it themselves, you know, and that's consistent. And I don't know how we get around that. Maybe it's just more education, but maybe just a comment for the campaign is we need to get the message out to report and not just shoot on sight, because I think it's just born into a lot of Montanans. Yeah, we'll take care of this. To emphasize the importance of that reporting.
I agree. Yeah, and that's one thing Tanya and I have discussed is the possibility of doing some listening sessions or public meetings or something of the sort along the High Line and bring the campaign and the information. So if you have ideas or locations or, you know, events that we could co-opt or whatever, let us know.
Yeah, you bet.
But you're right, at the meeting we had up at Sweetgrass, that was a big issue. And as soon as this stuff started hitting the newspapers, we started getting calls from hunters out of state wanting to come to Montana to hunt pig. We had calls from Super Cub pilots wanting to come and hunt in Montana. And you try to explain to them the incentive in saying, you don't want to come to eradicate wolves in Montana, you want to come to hunt, or eradicate feral swine, you want to come to hunt feral swine. And I said, you're proving why that law was put into place. I mean, that's the perfect reason why that law was put the way it was. I'm sure that the Department of Livestock and everybody was probably, yeah.
And just like Dale Nolte mentioned, it's the offers to help. I'm willing to help. I'll travel up to the High Line and help producers.
I think the message that, because landowners care, and if you give them the message that if you go out and shoot them, the possibility of them hiding and going somewhere else, I truly believe landowners will step right up and say, you bet, I will not, I will come and contact you so you can eradicate them. Because that's what we as landowners, I don't want them on my place, and if I know, because I didn't realize that before the Sweetgrass meeting, you know, that I don't want to shoot them, I want to tell somebody and say, come in here and get rid of them for me, because that's the best thing for us. So I don't think you'll have a problem if you get that message to them.
The getting them all piece.
Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
So I think we have 2 more questions back here, and then we'll wrap it up for lunch, so.
Hey, Stephanie and John, what's the involvement of Glacier in NISC? I don't think there's any. And then, John, can you do any control on a national park?
That's a good question, we never have, to my knowledge. We would certainly have to be in discussion with the park superintendent and so on, but.
Yeah, we have a really good relationship with the superintendent up there, not necessarily through MISC, but DNRC and a lot of the groups that I participate in, Jeff Mao, so I know he's aware of the issue, and our Park Service representative is in Yellowstone, so I think we could connect all the dots that way.
This might be for Martin, but maybe someone else knows. Do you know how many times someone has broken Montana's law and been, fined for moving things around?
We have not fined anyone yet. The one really concrete example that we have is the one that I mentioned where somebody brought them in and we sent a brand inspector out. Did not decide to do it. I mean, it was a relatively easy cleanup. The law was new. We used it as an educational piece. Certainly we do get regular phone calls for individual, I wouldn't say regular, but we do get phone calls at the Department of Livestock for individuals. I've been kind of going back and forth with somebody in Texas that wants to bring their pet wild feral pig into the state of Montana. We do have those conversations. We haven't issued a ticket.
I think just to add on to that, so Dr. Schmitz is correct. The most frequent call that we get is so-and-so is my neighbor and they're letting their pigs run. And we're concerned about, damage to our, to our, pasture or whatever. Or lawn or whatever, right? That's the deal. And then, so those are really tough to find out, to kind of get around or get to, because you have to figure out whether, okay, number one, was it intentional? Was it just an oversight? Is it is it likely a domestic pig, who it belongs to, and that's another, like Dr. Schmansky said, that's another reason why the Department of Livestock is kind of front and center in trying to determine kind of the source of the pig and some of those nuances. But no, we've been fortunate, knock on wood, not to have a significant number of reports or, from what we can tell, violations of these regulations so far. But it's that random pigs running out of the fence type of thing. Marias River, some reports there that we've gotten, et cetera, so.
And we also, there's brands, Travis, there are brands laws on the books about pigs?
Yes, pigs cannot run at large.
Yeah.
Even in open range counties?
In anywhere they can't run at large. And if they are at large, you have somebody calling real soon.
And we do there are tickets issued for
Yes.
that violation on a relatively regular basis.
All right, thank you.